50,000 years ago, there were no humans living in the part of North America that would become the United States. Today, there are some 335 million people living in that area. So, 50,000 years ago, nobody, 330 million today. Everybody who lives in the United States today is an immigrant or the descendant of an immigrant. And immigration has been an issue, a political issue, ever since the first colonies were established in what would become the United States. Now, of that immigration, 330 million people did not immigrate to the United States. The total immigration to the part of North America that would become the United States is somewhere between 80 and 100 million people. And the rest are people who were born in the United States. And that's where the controversy arises, where the controversy has typically arisen between those people who were born here, descendants of immigrants, because I say everybody was a descendant of an immigrant, and the new immigrants. Now, of the people who immigrated to the United States, not all of them to the American colonies or the United States, not all of them came voluntarily. Some 400,000 or so were brought to the United States as slaves. Obviously, they didn't volunteer for this, they were compelled. There were another 40 or 50,000 who were brought to the American colonies when they were British colonies as prisoners. Georgia in particular was an outdoor prison. It was a penal colony, an outdoor prison for felons convicted in Britain. So there were those, they were prisoners, they were brought against their will, although some of them probably figured that America was better than a prison in Britain. There's another category that's kind of a gray area in between, and these were indentured servants who came to the United States. They volunteered. That is, they signed contracts in England, in Britain, and the contracts bound them to labor once they arrived in the American colonies. And actually, the practice of indentured servitude continued even into the early years of the United States itself. So when they got to the United States, they were bound labor. Their labor, they had agreed to labor for a fixed number of years, depending on how old they were. And the reason they bound themselves to labor was that they didn't have the money to emigrate, to pay for their passage, to emigrate to the American colonies and then the United States. So they signed this contract saying that they would be bound. Their labor could and was sold, bought and sold. So they were bound laborers, but their bondage was temporary. The slaves, of course, their bondage was perpetual. Anyway, so these are the people who came to the United States. These the immigrants to the United States. Most of them came of their own volition. Some were compelled to come, but nonetheless, they came. And then they had descendants. And the descendants are those who constitute most of the population of the United States today. But from the beginning, there was often tension between earlier immigrants and their offspring and the current crop of immigrants. And the tension arose over various things. Part of it was that the people who were already here, they wanted to claim the best economic opportunities. They wanted to claim the best land. They wanted to claim the best in parts of the country where gold and silver were mined. They wanted the best claims, and they wanted to keep other people out. So they took advantage, they were taking advantage of opportunities that had come their way because they or their ancestors had arrived in America. And they wanted sort of essentially to shut the door on further arrival. So a lot of the opposition to immigration was economically based. Okay, I've got mine, and I don't want to share it with somebody else. And this is a pretty natural human sentiment. It's not unusual. It's not unique to Americans. And there's something else that goes on here. And there is, this is a basic question. Do the residents of any country, do Americans today, people living in the United States today, do they have any obligation to share the benefits of living in the United States with people not in the United States? To put it in the broadest terms, do Americans have any moral obligation to share their wealth with people who aren't in the United States currently, who aren't from the United States? Do foreigners have any claim on America's wealth? Okay? And this is a reasonable question to ask. And some people say no. They're foreigners, we're Americans, and that's that. That's why there are countries, that's why there are boundaries, that's why there are borders and laws about who can immigrate. Other people take the view that, well, we're all humans, and the ones who arrived in America and took advantage of its opportunities first, well, it really doesn't behoove them morally or otherwise to then close the doors to newcomers. But this battle over who's here, who should be here, what rules should govern who comes and who doesn't, these disputes have been going on for centuries. So one source of the tension, one source of the debate, one focus of the debate was economic. Another was, you could call it cultural, that those people who are coming now, they're not like us. They're not like us, the native-born people. So this emerged as early as, well, who knows? It might have arisen back in the days when the Native Americans, the indigenous peoples, indigenous is a little bit of a misleading term here because, as I point out, nobody was indigenous originally. 50,000 years ago, there wasn't anybody. The first arrivals seem to have shown up between 20,000 years ago and 15,000 years ago. And who knows, maybe at 10,000 years ago, they were already saying, we don't want any more people here, although that might not be the case. We'll get to that in just a moment. But there's often a feeling that these newcomers, these immigrants, are not like us. And they don't share our values, they don't share our history. They certainly don't share our history because they weren't born here. And you can see this as early as the 18th century. Benjamin Franklin, who was a pretty broad-minded guy, he was born in Boston, so he is one of the native-born Americans. His ancestors had come 50 or 100 years earlier from England. But he was a native-born Bostonian, and then he moved to Pennsylvania, which is where he spent most of his life. And he complained about immigrants to Pennsylvania from German-speaking countries. And the complaint that Franklin had, and was shared by many in Pennsylvania, was that these newcomers, they didn't buy into the culture of their new home. It was one thing for them to come to America, but if they came to America, at least they should try to act American. This was the feeling of Franklin and others in Pennsylvania. What Franklin complained of was that these Germans, they were often called the Pennsylvania Dutch, Deutsch is the word for German, they didn't learn English, they didn't send their kids to the English language schools, they didn't participate, they kept to themselves. And they were making Pennsylvania a different place than it had been before. This would be a common theme, that these immigrants, they're coming in and they're changing the nature of our society. They are foreigners, they're not like us. Complaint was made about the Germans in the 18th century. It was made about Irish in the 19th century. Before the 1840s, there was relatively little immigration to the United States from Ireland. But in the 1840s, the potato crop in Ireland, the subsistence of most of the Irish people, failed disastrously, and hundreds of thousands and millions of Irish had to leave Ireland. Many of them came to the United States. And the complaint about the Irish was, well, that they were Irish. There was a long-standing British prejudice against the Irish, even though the Irish weren't that different. And added on top of this was the fact that the Irish were mostly Catholic. So there was a religious element here. And if you look back on some of these complaints, it almost seems at times as though the native-born are looking for something to complain about in the immigrants. But opposition to Catholicism, anti-Catholicism, was a strong theme, a strong strain in American culture, in American history, until, well, certainly well into the 20th century, and it crops up occasionally even now. But after the Irish, enough Irish came that they were part then of, they had kids in America, and their children then were the native-born, and their children complained against the next wave of immigrants, and these from places like Italy and Greece and Poland. So one of the complaints about the people from Southern Europe was that their skin was darker. They didn't look like us. I mean, this is, the native-born say about the immigrants, they're not like us. And now they don't look like us. And in the case of people from Poland and Russia, well, many of them were Jewish. And so, the Protestants had a hard time accepting the Catholics, and then the Protestant and the Catholics had a hard time accepting the Jews. So this notion that these immigrants are different, this is something that has been a part of anti-immigrant feeling, again, from the beginning. And after the Irish and the Eastern and Southern Europeans, there was complaint against Chinese. Chinese immigration to the United States began in the middle of the 19th century, largely in response, at least at first, in response to the discovery of gold in California. Now, the Chinese were obviously different. They were different in appearance. They had different customs. They had different cuisine. They had different religion. They had different everything. And so it was easy to focus on the Chinese and say, okay, maybe we could accept the Germans, and then we could accept the Irish, and maybe we could accept the Italians, but we can't accept the Chinese. And in fact, the Chinese were the first group in the United States to be singled out by legislation, by federal laws, restricting immigration. And in 1882, Congress passed something generally called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which excluded Chinese laborers. It still allowed Chinese students to come in, or Chinese tourists, or Chinese business people, but Chinese laborers, no. And this gets at gets back to that underlying theme about the economic aspect of it, but it also brings to light a countervailing, welcoming spirit toward immigration. So I've suggested that much of the attitude toward immigration was hostile, that we don't want these newcomers. So yeah, there were people who made arguments that said that the newcomers, they're stealing our economic opportunity, they're not like us in language, religion, all this other thing. They're just not real Americans. Yes, there were those arguments. But, as I've just suggested, it was only in 1882. You have to get to the 1880s. This is 100 years into America's independent existence that the first laws actually restricting immigration occur. And so the policy of the United States until then was basically open doors, open arms. Come on, everybody come in. So where does this come from? If there is this current of opposition to immigration, why do the doors remain open? Well, that gets to the secondary aspect of it, or the alternate aspect of it. The United States, we'll focus on the American colonies and then the United States. The United States had something that Europe didn't have. And at first I'll talk about immigration to the United States from Europe, because this is where most of the immigrants came from. In any economic system, there is a balance or an imbalance between the different inputs into the production process. In an agricultural age, the principal inputs are labor and land. So you have to have land for the farms, and you have to people to work the land. In Europe, by, well, the 18th, 19th centuries, there was essentially an excess of labor and an insufficient supply of land. So there were a lot more people than there were land, which meant that the opportunities for individuals as farmers, we'll get to the Industrial Revolution in a moment, but basically farmers had a hard time making a living because there were too many of them and there wasn't enough land. That was the situation in Europe. The situation in the American colonies, then become the United States, was the opposite. There was lots of land and there weren't very many people. And so Europe, too many people, not enough land. America, not enough people, too much land. So the attraction was for the workers, the farmers, to leave Europe and go to America, which would make the land more valuable because there were more people to work on it, which meant that people who were already in America and who already owned land, they liked the idea that there would be more people coming because more people would bid up the price of their land. One of the surest ways of making a modest fortune, even a large fortune in American economic history, was to purchase land and then wait for the value of the land to go up. And it did consistently. It didn't always do it at the same speed, but more fortunes were made in American history by purchasing land, waiting for the value of the land to go up and selling it than by any other means. And so, people who had land, sometimes farmers, but sometimes speculators, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, all sorts of founding fathers, all sorts of people in the United States in the colonial era and the early national era, they bought land. They bought land not intending to use it themselves. George Washington was a farmer. He used land, yes, but he bought a lot more land than he would ever use. They bought it for the purpose of reselling it. And this is a common practice in real estate in the United States today. Buy a home, buy a piece of land, and hang on to it for a while and sell it, and you make a big profit. But all this depends on a growing population. And one way to boost the population growth is to bring in immigrants. And so the balance of opinion in America before the 1880s was that immigrants are good. And so our policies, our laws will encourage immigrants to come in. And in fact, various states competed for immigrants. They wanted to make the immigrants come to their state rather than another state. And this had to do with the value of the land. It also had to do with once a new state, for example, was established, towns would be built and people would start up businesses in the towns. And what they wanted was population. More population meant more business. More business meant more profits, and they'd get wealthy. And it became, and it still is, a common theme in American politics for cities and states to compete for companies to build factories in their city or industries to move to their state. Because if the industries move, then there will be jobs and people will come. And the more people, the value of the businesses will go up, the value of the land will go up, and everybody there will get rich. So this idea of sort of boosterism to promote your state, to promote your city, to promote your country, this lay behind the open door policy toward immigration. But, as I said, there are people who are also complaining about the immigrants and how the immigrants are taking opportunity away. This reaches a critical point once America moves into the industrial age. Because in the industrial age, well, workers leave the farms and they go to work in factories and in mines and in other places that involve industry. And as they go to work, they discover that as long as there are lots and lots of people willing to go to work, willing to take those jobs, then the workers don't have much leverage in pay negotiations with the employers. And the employers can pay relatively little. They can pay as little as possible because there's always somebody else willing to take the job. So workers, the first thing that they do is they band together and they form unions. And the idea of the unions is instead of the workers negotiating one-on-one with the manufacturers, with the owners, they can negotiate as a group and they have more bargaining leverage and they can bring wages up. At the same time, however, they realize that if there is a continual inflow of laborers, as in immigration from Europe, then the owners, the manufacturers, might very well say to the union, forget it, we don't want to talk to you, we're going to fire all of you because there are new laborers coming in. And so the unions and the workers as a group, they had an incentive to try to restrict immigration. Because unless, they would say to themselves, unless we can limit the supply of labor, then we'll never get our wages up. So the industrial working class found itself in a position where it tried to restrict immigration. Now, the flip side of this is that the manufacturers, they love immigration because the more workers available, the less they have to pay their own workers. And there became this political battle between the workers who want less immigration and the manufacturers who want more immigration. The workers achieved their first success with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred, as I said, Chinese workers. These were the ones who were going to undercut the wages of workers already here. And a principal reason that the workers, there was actually something called the Working Men's Party in California where most of the Chinese immigrants first landed. They were very well organized and they were able to get a law passed against Chinese workers because the Chinese seemed sort of more foreign than anybody from Europe, and also there was sufficient racism in American society toward Asians of the time that, okay, it was easy enough to get people on board and say, we don't need any Chinese, we don't want any Chinese. And so that was the first restriction. But the desire for restrictive legislation continued. But the workers and the opponents of immigration couldn't reach a critical mass until a couple of decades into the 20th century. And some of this has to do with increasingly large immigration from Europe. Some of it has to do with World War I. World War I reminded Americans of their European roots, and one might have thought, okay, it would make Americans more open to the idea of immigration from Europe. Yeah, except that the United States got dragged into Europe's war. And Americans, a lot of them didn't like this idea. But furthermore, the war itself cut off immigration, most immigration from Europe. The would-be immigrants had a hard time getting out of their countries amid the war, and with German U-boats and British ships patrolling the Atlantic, immigrant ships couldn't make their way across, and the shipping was used for other purposes anyway. And Americans discovered, well, at least some Americans discovered, you know what? Our country can survive without immigrants. And so, and then finally, after the war, there was this backlash against Europe and things European because Americans thought that the war had turned out badly. So in the 1920s, for the first time, there was serious and comprehensive immigration restriction legislation. I mentioned the legislation against Chinese immigration in the 1920s. In fact, in 1924, an immigration law was passed that put comprehensive limits on immigration. And at this time, before World War I, immigration had been more than a million immigrants per year. And the new law of 1924 capped this at a much lower level, but it also placed particular quotas on who could come to the United States from which countries. And in fact, countries of the British Isles and of Northern and Western Europe, they got higher quotas than countries of Southern and Eastern Europe. And most immigration from Asia was shut out. And the idea here was to make these immigrants, well, basically look more like the people who were already here. And so the quotas were relatively high for the British Isles. So the American colonies were established by the British, and Germans could come at a relatively generous rate because by this time there were a lot of Germans, and Irish could come there because a lot of Irish, but not so many Greeks, not so many Italians, not so many Poles, not so many Russians. So it was clearly an effort to make the immigration look like a majority of the people who already lived here. And again, it reflects this feeling on the part of many people that these immigrants are changing the nature, they're changing the face of the country, and we don't like that. So from the 1920s until the 1960s, the United States operated under this very restrictive immigration system. In the 1960s, there was a revision that was passed to the immigration law, and the revision was one that did not intend to increase immigration a lot, but what it did was to allow family members, people who were already in the United States, who were residents, who were citizens of the United States, they could bring their families together. So they could bring in wives, they could bring in parents, they could bring in children. And it was thought that this would just open the gates, the immigration gates, just a little bit, not too much. And in addition, there was a clause in the law that allowed immigrants with particular skills to come to the head of the line so that they could be of particular value to the United States. Now, the particular skills part, this didn't surprise anybody the way it worked out. But there was a huge surprise in what this family reunification provision of the law allowed. Because there was this immigration where somebody, an immigrant who's already here, who came in under the regular quota, would bring a spouse, and they would bring children, and would bring parents. And once they're here, they would bring their parents, their relatives, and so on. And so it, in fact, created a very large increase in immigration. And it surprised the people who sponsored the legislation. But there was something else going on as well, and that is that I've mentioned the laws against particular immigrants and the immigration restriction laws. Well, you can pass laws about who can come in and who can't come in, but people sometimes break laws. And especially if you live in a country that shares a border with the United States. So Canada shares a very long border with the United States. Mexico shares a shorter but fairly long border with the United States. There weren't many Canadians who wanted to immigrate into the United States, at least in violation of the laws. But there were a lot of people from Mexico, some Mexicans, but also people coming through Mexico, who looked at the economic opportunities in the United States and said, we want these. This was the principal reason that people have always come to the United States. They come for economic opportunity. Some come for religious freedom and personal freedom and other things like that. But economic opportunity is the real engine of immigration to the United States. And they discovered that whatever the laws said, well, maybe we can sneak under and we can take jobs. Now, they would have to work in a kind of black or gray market, but this actually sometimes suited the employers, because if a worker was here without authorization, without coming through the legal system, then that worker couldn't very well complain to the legal authorities if the worker got stiffed on pay, or if the working conditions weren't safe or anything like that. So there developed this black market and this illegal immigration system. And this has been something that has been a huge issue in American politics from then until now. And it's one that the system is grappling with. And the two political parties have basically taken the positions that the Republicans want to clamp down on immigration, and the Democrats are more open to more immigration. Both parties sort of fudge a little bit about, so what about the legal versus illegal part, and how about people who are here without authorization already? What do we do about that? But it is an ongoing issue. The immigration question is a polarizing question, and it's a question that has been with Americans ever since the establishment of the first American colonies.